The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 21st chapter. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And Jesus said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified. For these things must take place, but the end will not follow immediately." Then Jesus said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You'll be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord. Just a quick side note, there are some of you who sometimes request I put my sermon in your box, and I think I put one in the wrong box. So if you got one and you weren't expecting one, it wasn't a hint that you should listen or something like that. So the last time we had this gospel reading, it was the Sunday after the 2016 presidential election. And you might recall that in the months prior to that election, it had begun to feel like so much was at stake. Perhaps more than at any other moment in our history, our country was at a turning point. And there was a lot of weight on everyone's shoulders. The responsibility of carrying it around was exhausting. It was about saving America, saving democracy, saving women and minorities, saving jobs, saving our security, saving immigrants. Such a heavy burden. And so this little apocalypse that Jesus' description of natural disaster and famine and plague, well, at the time it seemed laughable, because if we didn't laugh, we would cry. With the weight of the world on the shoulders of the American electorate 3 years ago, it felt like the end of the world might indeed hinge on how we cast our vote. And it felt that way to folks no matter whom they were voting for. Well, 3 years later, not much has changed as we enter into this last year before we head to the polls to cast our votes again. And we're just as divided, if not more divided, than we were before. Maybe on some issues, a few steps have moved forward, but in others, more than a few steps have moved back. And there are daily updates on breaking news in the impeachment hearing. And just this week, there is news of another school shooting in California, and a school district right in our backyard shut down for threats of violence. And beyond our country are the realities of global climate change, the precarious balancing of a world economy, violent protests, ongoing wars. We're looking for some solid ground to stand on. And this is the word from God that confronts us today. Jesus at the temple, he and his disciples just witnessing the widow giving an offering of all she had. And some in the group are commenting now on how impressive the temple building is. Yet Jesus himself was much more impressed with the faith of that widow than the grandeur of the building. So he announces that the temple is something that one day will be in ruin. Surprised by this prediction, those talking with Jesus want to know when will it happen? They want to know what they can watch for, to be prepared for when the temple would fall. For them, the loss of that place would be devastating. It wasn't simply the building that mattered, but it was what it represented. It was central to their Jewish identity. Professor Richard Swanson describes the temple as a place where God's finger touched the earth and held it still. So just the mention that holy, sacred place, that anchor of faith and life would be destroyed, has the people immediately looking for answers, for a sign from Jesus. And you might notice that he really doesn't answer the question. And the point in telling them that the temple would fall wasn't to make a flashy, all-knowing prediction. And the point was to remind them that that building, no matter how meaningful or symbolic, was itself temporary. Now, there's another audience listening to this story from Luke as well, not just the one that is gathered around Jesus, but the ones who will hear Luke's gospel recited 70 years later. 70 years after Jesus' death, and only 30 years after the actual destruction of the temple. For those listening to Luke's telling of the gospel then, and for us now, Jesus wasn't predicting the fall of the temple, he was describing history. And so it is with the rest of his long list, describing false prophets, war, insurrections, nations rising against each other, earthquakes and famines and plagues. They aren't signs or predictions, because haven't we seen these things all throughout time? Jesus is describing the condition of the world. Buildings fall, hard stuff, messy stuff, chaotic and unpredictable stuff happens. And in the middle of that list, Jesus says, "Do not be afraid." These things will happen. The end will not follow immediately. Or in other words, Jesus is saying all this stuff will occur, but it won't be the end of the world. So yeah, I guess now here at this point, we can't help but notice that Jesus doesn't always offer the most comforting responses. I mean, just because something isn't the actual end of the world, well, it doesn't mean it won't feel that way. And whether you're listening to Jesus on those temple steps as a Jew whose whole life has been under Roman rule, with the only sure and certain thing being that their way of life revolves around the temple, or whether you're listening to Luke's gospel in the short 30 years after the actual horrible destruction of the temple became a reality, or whether you are listening right here and now in a country divided, reeling from another school shooting, whether you're listening from the place of experiencing tragedy or loss or death in a more personal way that is close to home. We might hear ourselves saying, "It's too soon, Jesus, it's too soon. We aren't ready to hear you say the world isn't over." So if we can't hear this from Jesus right now, well, that's okay, but listen anyway. And maybe put it in your pocket and bring it out when you're ready, because he is right. Once that initial grief work, and that's really what it is, grieving is hard work. Once it has occurred, then there comes a time when we do go about living into whatever comes next. It's interesting to think that this story is about the temple falling, when we live in a time where a cultural shift in our society has displaced the centrality of practices in a life of faith. Life in community no longer revolves around worship times and church activities. And claiming the status of Christian affiliation, let alone denominational roots, has become less and less the norm. And whether we realize it or not, we are grieving this change, this shift, this loss, this death of how we used to be able to do things. And the church, that is church with the big C, must do some grief work and then begin with faith and hope and courage to move forward into whatever God has up God's sleeve next, no matter how difficult it might be. Death and resurrection go hand in hand. Without Christ's death, there can be no resurrection, and without resurrection, Christ's death is for nothing. Well, as if Jesus hasn't pushed us enough about it not being the end of the world, he also tells us in the midst of heartbreaking, world-ending moments, we will be called on to testify. Well, that just seems like a little too much to ask. I mean, how can we possibly say anything when at best we feel we can only sob in despair or cry out in rage? But Jesus says, don't be afraid, when clearly being afraid is the natural response to a situation. And he says it's not the end of the world, well, when it feels like tomorrow might possibly not come. And then he tells us to speak when we think we have nothing or maybe even too much to say. But then finally, he gives us something reassuring. He says when we're called on to testify in the midst of trouble, we don't need to worry about what we will say or prepare our defense. Jesus will give us words of wisdom. He will give us the words for our testimony. And thank goodness. Thank goodness, because haven't you ever accidentally, but sort of on purpose, hit send on that angry or hurt email or text or social media post? Or maybe left a rambling, emotional late-night voicemail, but then regretted it within seconds, knowing you can't get it back? Or even in face-to-face conversations, haven't we all had those emotionally charged moments when we can almost see our words hanging in the air and then see the hurtful impact our words have on the hearer? What if in those instances we listened? We waited for Jesus' words of wisdom to fill us. Not speaking or typing or preparing our defense in advance, but listening and receiving the response and the testimony that Jesus gives to us. How often it is that we prepare a defense and then we listen to respond instead of listening to understand. Jesus says, make up your minds not to prepare a defense. He gets it. He knows that in fear and uncertainty, we will want to spout off and defend our opinions or cling to our positions. That our words can fail us. But Jesus gives us words that are strong and bear the truth. And he sets us free to testify to the hope that we look to and the love that we experience and the faith to which we cling. Even and especially when the world seems to be unraveling around us. As we listen for Jesus, the words he gives us will be honest and they'll be challenging, but they'll also be compassionate and grace-filled. When Jesus gives us words of wisdom, well, they will hold within them the good news. And we can be truth tellers, but still be kind. And we must also expect that Jesus might be giving other people a testimony that we need to hear. Can we listen to others as we wish they would listen to us? So let us make up our minds not to prepare a defense, not to enter into conversations with fear or with a plan to somehow make it go our way. And when we speak, Jesus promises he will give us the words to testify. And in the words that Jesus gives to us prior in Luke, we know then, by testifying, Jesus means bringing good news to the poor, sight to the blind, release to the captive, and letting the oppressed go free. And Jesus doesn't promise these conversations won't be hard. In fact, we can expect to experience some betrayal and some hatred. But Jesus does promise that not a hair on our head will perish. And he promises that by our endurance, we will gain our souls. But be careful, because this is not a transaction. Not a transaction of receiving our souls in exchange for doing what is right, but it is a free and gracious gift that we receive as we trust our Savior and not ourselves or others to save the world, or dare I say, save the church and the future of the gospel. The burden is lifted, and it's replaced with a joyful calling and a freedom to serve the world while we testify to our God who saves it, and to serve the gospel while we testify to our God who embodies it, who is the good news. Amen.